This is a labor. Can you hear me in the back? You know those dreams you have where you're not clothed? This is a variation of it. My leg went to sleep, and then all of a sudden I heard my name called. There's nothing to do. I mean, it's starting to come back, but I apologize for my approach to the microphone. Yeah, I had one beer at dinner. Honestly, my leg went to sleep. Thank you guys for having me here. John, you know, a year ago you started talking about it, and I was intimidated. You know, what does somebody from Montana have to talk to you guys in Colorado about water or community or anything? We're so new and young up there. White folks are up there. Anyway, it's just, you know, when you come to a new place or a different place, it's just your nature to be intimidated. So you guys gave me this nice water bottle, and I took a sip. And it's so new that it still has that chemical tang in the liner. And I thought, damn, they're different down here. I thought it was like gin in there or something. It was like 20 ounces of gin for the reading. But yeah, thank you. Yeah, building community. I really am enjoying the evening. I want to thank everybody who I've got to meet with the conference. Thanks, Teresa, for the afternoon and the lovely introduction, and thank you, Holly and Angie and Samara, for your introductions and your, I want to call it work. It is work. Writing is work. It was wonderful. Holly, when you were reading, I was thinking you went to Puget Sound for a year. I think, boy, I know why you're in Gunnison. That was some tough characters there. Thank you, Jeff, for your introduction and for getting me here. John, it's a pleasure to meet you and hear about your work with the sustainability and your biology stories. I appreciate it. I didn't get to visit with George at dinner, but I heard great things about everything that he's done and the tradition of this conference, which speaks to itself. Thornton enjoyed being at dinner with, likewise. Dr. Pena, thank you for the music. That charango was outrageous. That little baby mandolin, baby banjo, it was just eerie. It was haunting. It was gorgeous. Thank you very much. And Aaron, thanks for your unhappy letter with the beauty at the beginning and end, that's the shit stew that we live in. You know, it's nice in the morning. It's nice when you lay your head down on the pillow to go to bed, but it's a tough grind in between. But it beats the alternative. And I was thinking when you were reading that, the greatest form of respect you can have for somebody is to tell the truth. And so thank you for respecting your home and the audience to tell some hard truths and keep looking for beauty. I was making notes while I was listening. Your theme tonight about resilience, I can come to Colorado, I guess. I do know a little bit about resilience despite being so new to Montana. I've been up there 23 years, 24 years. Been working to try and get wilderness up there in this valley, the Yak, where there's not any wilderness and people just fight you tooth and nail. You guys know the drill. And we're finally, I think, about to get it. We've got a new senator, and he's had the courage to introduce a very good wilderness bill for the Yak, but it hasn't been easy, to say the least. I won't bore you with the details, but we've had, if you define resilience as what biologists call the range of historic variability, or what basketball players call bouncing the ball up and down. We've had ups and downs. We're real close. So I can come here with that experience. Another thing I think that I'm hearing from this conference is that stories matter. They really matter in Montana. Where I live, there's a huge responsibility with that resiliency. Nobody's ever lived there. The Yak Valley was under ice for, it's only been out from beneath the ice for about 7,000 years. The rest of Montana emerged about 10,000 years ago, but the Yak was the last place to have the ice go away. So it's a much newer place. It's a very Edenic, garden-like place. The Kootenai didn't live in the Yak. There are no permanent encampments up there. They were a fish culture. They lived along the Kootenai River to the south, but nobody has ever lived in the Yak except for really the last 100 years or so, with the homesteads and some mines that were scratched at the lower end of the valley in the 1900s. So with my paltry 24 years there, I'm almost 25% of human history living in this place. I mean, it's a big responsibility. The stories that you lay down, whether they're true or false, are what's going to last if they're good, and you know, be like grooves cut for the rivers to follow. They really matter, and it's the same down here. I mean, you guys have been at it a lot longer than up in the Yak, but it really matters. And listening to you talk and your stories, I just have that reinforced. John said something tonight about imagination and how powerful a tool it is for humans, and I realized it's all we've got. I mean, the animals who've been here for so long, millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, as opposed to our puny 180,000 year membership in the club, they have instinct. We don't have instinct. We haven't been here long enough to have that reassurance of deep, deep instinct. And so instead we have to guess and probe and imagine, and that is our tool, and that is what stories are. So we're, for the next 920,000 years, we're faking it and imagining it. So it matters. I loved your differentiation between greatness and bigness also. That's really profound. The essay I want to read to you guys tonight about two very important rivers to me in Montana. One river is very big and the other is small but great. You sure you can hear me? There's so many of you so far back there. Great. I'm not a river person. I prefer to be up in the mountains, back in the forest that lead right up to the highest edges of the mountains, with their bright basins of sunlight and wildflowers and too much sky. I like the tactile, graspable here and now of the forest, the soft Kootenai soil beneath my feet, far more than the always going away blue-silver ungraspability of water or the nothingness of sky. I do like to look down at rivers from far above and to see the shining elegance of each, like one silver sentence, with which they pass through the cleave of the mountains and the velvet forest they nurture and which nurtures them. Where I come from, in the rainforest of Montana's Yak Valley, both sides of the river are usually heavily timbered. There is not so often the dark and light, dry and wet, yin and yang cycle of north slope, south slope, grassland and conifer. Where I come from, on the Kootenai National Forest, there's water everywhere, but it is back in the dark forest where much of the business of living occurs. We depend upon the rivers for our lives, but I am wary of committing to them. I like being able to come and go. I think it's interesting how the most mercurial thing, the river, the thing that is always in quick motion, is in some ways the most predictable and dependable, able to shoulder this burden of slow and tentative non-committal by all others. My heart is in the Kootenai watershed, one of the two great watersheds in western Montana that lie beyond the historic Missouri, on the other side, the west side of the Continental Divide. The other big watershed is the Clark Fork, the Kootenai's neighbor, where in the town of Missoula, I'm currently renting a house while my daughters finish high school. As with the Kootenai, there have been environmental crimes on the Clark Fork, crimes of harm and greed, with the lesser crimes of inattention filling the interstices like silt between gravel. You can climb to the top of the high peaks in my drainage and peer down into the Clark Fork. There are ridges where our two watersheds will squabble over the same drop of water, the same flake of snow, and being on the north slope, we usually get it. Something else we got up in the Kootenai was the W.R. Grace Company, where in the lower Yak Valley, the top of a mountain, Vermiculite Mountain, was sawed off. Asbestos mining began there in 1923 and proceeded until 1990, when the passage of the Clean Air Act finally made that mining not only a moral crime, but finally a legal crime. Before it was over, however, an estimated 15 billion pounds of ore were driven down off the one mountain and into town, loaded into boxcars and shipped east and west, with ribbons of toxic swirl attending the train's passages day after day, and in town after town, with the rail lines following the routes of rivers. Much in the news is Lincoln County's 30-fold epidemic of asbestosis and mesothelioma, the former disease a scar-bound, gritty incrustation of the lungs that robs air and ultimately life, and the latter an incurable 6-week wildfire of a cancer. Less reported is Spokane's outbreak of multiple sclerosis, the highest in the nation, maybe the world. Spokane is where the Libby ore was poured into sacks for marketing. And less reported, too, is the prevalence of the strange and debilitating autoimmune disorders in Lincoln County that are MS-like: lupus, rheumatoid arthritis, scleroderma, fibromyalgia. The asbestos fibers are incredibly tiny, which is why they're so deadly. They pierce and perforate and scratch the pleura of the lungs and stomach. Asbestos-related diseases have sickened thousands and killed hundreds in the small town. And though the mill was closed in 1990, the dying continues. Neither is the Clark Fork immune from such abuses. In the mining town of Butte, ASARCO gouged out the richest hill on earth as it mined and processed billions of pounds of ore containing silver, copper, and gold before the associated toxic tailings, arsenic chief among them, broke free from their impoundment and moved in a great plume downstream before coming to rest against an old weakened dam in Milltown just upstream of Missoula, the Garden City. A local conservation group, the Clark Fork Coalition, which helped tear out that dam and haul away all those acre-feet of poison, asked what my vision might be for the Clark Fork in the next 25 years. I'm not sure I have a vision. I'm astounded by what they've accomplished already, tearing out a dam and rerouting, as if in a major surgery, a great river. Downstream of the old Milltown Dam, and what do we call that site now that the dam is gone? The place where the wound was, but where soon there will not even be a scar? There in the Garden City, where there is so much hope, I feel that I'm better able to reflect on the nature of scars and crimes and to rest for a while. The Clark Fork has been good to me. Poets write about still water lakes beside which are perched small cabins with their yellow square window light reflecting on the night waters, loon trill carrying for miles across those quiet waters, the scent of pines and the hooting of owls, all that sleepy stuff. Those fortunate enough to live by running water know how lucky those of the Clark Fork are to live by a slightly livelier pace, to have our lungs and brains stimulated, energized by the motion and annual cycles of a wild river. Any vision of the 21st century in the Clark Fork or its surrounding watersheds must include a template, a plan for addressing our scars. That's not whining. On the contrary, it's courageous. Something important happened a long time ago in the Yak Valley. 25 years ago, which in white folk time represents about 1/5 of all the time that ever was. 1/5 of history with a capital H. A ludicrous consideration, hubris with a capital H, and yet it's also one of our realities. We haven't been here for very long, and in that short time we've been able to do tremendous damage. It is not impossible then to imagine that in those same segments of human time, 25, 50, 75-year whacks, we can also accomplish some significant forward movement, some reclamation, some bounce. 25 years ago, a wild-eyed hippie do-gooder social justice kid, Scott Daly, came to the Yak Valley from Pennsylvania. Just a kid, a 20-something, with his girlfriend looking for adventure. He immediately fell in love with the landscape and began dreaming a magnificent vision in the Yak. It wasn't just enough to protect the last wild country up there and to stitch together, to reconnect, the in-between terrestrial places. The culture of wildness and of ecological health needed to be retold and celebrated up there, he realized, preserved where it was present and retold where such a story was lacking or had gone awry. Such work could take decades, he said, but he is such an idealist. He said that every journey begins with but one step. Such reformation wouldn't just be artsy-fartsy cultural and storytelling, he said, but needed to be demonstrated in on-the-ground projects too. He went straight to the heart of the most damaged watershed on the Upper Yak, the one nobody could possibly argue had not been overcut. And slowly, year by year, he set about replacing blown-out culverts, surveying streams, securing funding for fisheries biologists, employing local workers. He and Robin King, the director of a local conservation group, the Yak Valley Forest Council, created a nonprofit restoration company, Headwaters Restoration Partners, and took on the task of not moving mountains, but of putting them back together. I have always been extraordinarily impressed by those visionaries who possess an intensity of focus, what we sometimes call obsession, but which is really maybe only an extreme acuity of the senses. And I have an even more special place in my heart for those visionaries who can dream 2 or more dreams at once, like Scott, who typically has half a dozen or more percolating, intense, major dreams. Perhaps such creative response is the natural outgrowth from a land of such extraordinary biodiversity and such a duality of existence, situated between the firescape of the Rockies and the fungal, swampy rot of the Pacific Northwest. Scott writes grants for our little group now and runs a native plant nursery and restoration company in the Clark Fork watershed in the downstream port of Sandpoint, where he's also currently trying to restore his young body from a strange and aggressive bone cancer. The doctors keep cutting parts of him out, organs and bones. There's troubling spots on his lungs that grow then shrink. But he's pushing on, he's looking for a cure, and he's looking for a story. Thus far, Robin and Scott have strained like great baleen whales swimming through the not-so-vast sea of private funders, over $1 million out of the air for the Upper Yak, a far cry from the $500 million that rebuilding the Clark Fork has secured. But it's all similar work, and the best work, making something sick better. Being proud of our scars and responsible for their rehabilitation is not a particularly dramatic vision, but it's the vision we need now throughout the West, coupled with one more push to protect these last few crumbs of roadless public lands we have not yet despoiled. The lockbox, the jewels, the treasure. Scott, in Sandpoint, is growing wilders and alder, repairing the thousands of miles of old logging roads that circle some mountains in the Yak like the scars of surgery, the tracks of the roads acting like glistening though artificial rivers each spring, carrying water out of the valley and out of the forest rather than leaving it where it needs to stay. When we are lucky, our work becomes our lives. I keep meaning to talk about the big river, the Clark Fork, instead of the Kootenai. The Clark Fork has been good to me. I bought a float tube so that I can glide down its cold waters with my wife and daughters. Sometimes in the midst of my relaxation, my healing, I wonder, is the water safe to touch? Is the air safe to breathe? Is this how tame I have become for such thoughts, the baseline of our existence, eating and breathing, to be so conscious in my life rather than busying myself with the loftier and more evolved goals of considering spirit and spirituality? That which Joyce called the challenge to, quote, forge in the smithy of my soul a new consciousness of my race. I love how the Clark Fork looks at night as it passes through Missoula. I love the North Bank and the South Bank. I wouldn't mind seeing some more cobble or brick streets downtown with floral and tribal designs intricately inlaid in places containing secret and important messages that can best be seen from afar. The cobble roads would slow traffic down a bit and would glisten in the spring rains. But beyond that, I don't really have a vision. Sometimes I almost feel satisfied, which is an unfamiliar sensation indeed. I love the energy of the river, even if I do not love the river itself. Every time I'm near it, it humbles me, pulls somehow at the threads in me that tell me I'm becoming a slacker, that I'm growing benumbed to the world, a creature of routines, which is not the same thing as a creature of rhythms and cycles. It's awfully easy here in the Great Recession to work harder, grumble louder, to reel through the days, stewing in a constant low-level simmer of angst and despair. It's easy, even in the presence of a bright river and surrounded by sharp, steep mountains, to say tomorrow, to recall old times spent in the mountains, and to dream of future trips, but to procrastinate and instead push on, grind on, just working. Sometimes it almost seems that walking across the river and catching a whiff of spring cottonwoods, or looking up at the mountains and remembering, is enough, in a slackwater kind of way, is at least better than nothing. I think such an assertion is even defensible, though I don't believe it in my heart. Everybody is guilty of something. In my mind, the W.R. Grace defenders were guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, mayhem, manslaughter, the whole corporate litany. But every day, walking or driving or riding back and forth across the river, I'm guilty of my own kind of taking away, of letting unexplored forests slip through my fingers, hikes not taken, hunts not made. It's one of the great lulling beauties of life, letting days without action slip past, and yet, if too much slips past, we become complicit in the daily little deaths we inflict upon what Mary Oliver has called our one wild and precious life. The poet Richard Hugo was born the same year the first mining road was built up into Vermiculite Mountain, the same year the first bulldozer blade cut earth, but he knew the story before it began. In his poem, The Towns We Know and Leave Behind, the Rivers We Carry With Us, dedicated to the Ohio poet James Wright, he says, I forget the names of towns without rivers. A town needs a river to forgive the town. Whatever river, whatever town, it is much the same. The cruel things I did, I took to the river. I begged the current, make me better. Your town, your river, or mine, it is much the same. A murdering man lives on the land, in a shack the river birds hate. He rubs the red shriek of night from his eyes. He prays to water, don't let me do that again. The river is there to forgive the town, and without a river, a town abuses the sky. The river is there to forgive what I did. Let's name my river, Duwamish, and let's admit the river birds don't hate my home. That's a recent development, really, like mercury in the cod. Without a river, a town abuses the air. The river is there to forgive what I did. The river birds hate what I did until I name them. Your river or mine, it is much the same. A murdering man lived on the bank. Here's the trick. We had to stay drunk to welcome the river, to live in a shack, to die on the bank, beneath the bigoted sky, under the river birds, day after day, to murder away all water that might die. A murdering man is dead on the bank of your new river, the East. On mine, the Clark Fork, it is much the same. Your river has gulls and tugs. Mine has eagles and sky. I rubbed last night from my eyes. I asked bright water, what's happened? The river, I'm not sure which one, says water has no special power. What should I do? Or you? Maybe my vision for the Clark Fork, as well as for the Kootenai, two injured watersheds in recovery, has less to do with aquatic and terrestrial monitoring and more to do with people who are briefly connected to it and the development, the restoration of people's relationship to it. That at the end of their run, they each be able to say they lived a purposeful and, what word to use, satisfactory life. We will never become gods, nor should we, but at least we can become more human. And bringing back a thing that has gone away, a precious thing, is as powerful a penance as I can imagine. If you believe that a god or gods created something and then we took it away, the least we can do is try to bring it back. I don't get or like fish or fishing. It looks suspiciously like golf, except you can't see what's going on beneath the surface. You're wishing, striving after something you usually can't see, and with what seems to me an extreme degree of separation in the medium, you up on land, your prey underwater. It's loud, too, along the river. You can't hear your enemies sneaking up behind you. In the yak, we are always aware of where our enemies are. We are the first to hear, to feel the distant throb of those black helicopters. I just don't like rivers, really. I like the woods. It makes sense to me that the animals in the woods come down to the river for a brief drink and then turn and go back into the woods. I took kayaking classes in Missoula, but I like the float tubes better. My frayed and throbbing rotator cuffs have the elasticity of last hunting season's styrofoam coffee cups floating around on the floorboard of a 1980 F-150. I like the rubber duck quality of the float tubes, the connection to childhood. I think it's really cool that there's fast water for folks who like it, and fish for people who like to harass fish. If you're lucky, you learn eventually that there are places that are not such a good fit for you, and you accommodate your paths to reflect that time-crafted negotiation, rather than seeking with your one brief life to wear down and sand and polish the world to your fit. I don't know why I'm so lulled by the Clark Fork. I'm not a stranger to worry. I can stand on the bridge in town and look down at the lush springtime clamor, can feel the river shudder against the pylons below, and yet envision a globally warmed future in which below me lies the pale skeletal dry bed of where water flows no more, a cobbled arroyo in which W.R. Grace executives, with dyed mohawks and giant safety pins in their cheeks, rollerblade each day, machetes in hand, and the day's scalps swinging from their belts. Tent cities pitched in the center of where the river was, and town a smoldering ruin. I worry that Congress will not be able to overturn the Supreme Court's decision about corporations' freedom of speech. Speech somehow being interpreted as the ability to pour money into political campaigns. If I take a rocket launcher and start lobbing rounds at the Grace Tower in New York, is that not likewise a form of expression of so-called speech? I worry about the Tea Party and its stupid, ignorant, self-pitying violence against the democracy they claim to support. I worry about hate. I worry that Scott, fixer of Little Rivers, won't get well. I worry that he won't get all he wanted out of this life. I worry that my editor will get fired if I don't write a bestseller. I worry that Scotty's Table will take the Chapino off its menu. I worry that Sugars will get rid of that duck breast. The woman who replaced Scott as executive director of the Yak Valley Forest Council, Robin, was beset by a mysterious illness, a meningioma, a soft tissue growth between her brain and skull. Was it a result of absorbing those countless microscopic, nanoscopic asbestos fibers? Nobody knows. She had the top of her skull cut off. The growth was scooped out, the skull sewn back on, and now she is well again. A new study came out last year about venous tangles in the brain, the nervous system's command central, possibly becoming blocked by the penetrations of tiny shunts, such as asbestos fibers, which then sets off an autoimmune response. I don't know. My area of expertise is in representing the sounds and names and colors and textures of things, not in understanding them. Still, I can't help but wonder. With regard to story and the elements we put into a painting or a tale, or for that matter, history with our actions as well as inactions, I am particularly attentive to stories of Vermiculite Mountain with its top sawed off, or the richest hill in Butte, and of these attempts to reclaim that which we so quickly and greedily and youthfully tore apart. As a storyteller, I'm interested in using the same boundaries and directives and templates of how something was taken away to then reclaim that which was taken. It is admittedly the strategy of a weaker opponent, but it works in nature. The bones of lynx and hare indistinguishable in death, each so perfectly the obverse of the other, each so necessary. Imagine that as the Vermiculite Mountain up in the Yak is a garden, so too is the richest hill on earth a garden, one we likewise despoiled without moderation and in record time. Just as any place on a landscape where something really bad has happened makes a scar, so too can places where really fine things have happened leave a mark. It is that way in a life, and it must therefore be that way in a landscape to which we are so briefly and tenuously but significantly attached. One of my goals for the Kootenai watershed has long been for a grand biological survey, as if encountering that land for the first time, an exhaustive, scientifically replicable assay and inventory of every species' presence or absence, distribution and density, undertaken in the spirit of explorer Michael Fay's great transect of Africa. You can just look on the map and tell that the yak is like a little Africa. Africa condensed to 1 million acres, with rich borders in every direction, unprecedented diversity, unique species relationships. 4 species of chickadees sharing the same habitat fringes, the rarest forms of old growth. The lowest elevation of grizzly bears left in the continental U.S., and yet grizzlies that also feed upon the winter-killed carcasses of mountain goats, arguing with golden and bald eagles over each summer's glacier-shrunk revelations of such mummified scraps. In extreme or unique ecosystems, extreme or unique adaptations evolve, as might extreme or unique stories. Sometimes in dreaming of getting rid of your scars, you begin with a map. I remember as if it was only yesterday, Robin and Scott and me sitting in our little office and pointing to the million-acre garden of the yak and beginning to dream our dreams. It was only yesterday. 25 years shot by. With regard to our idea of an inventory, we've missed our mark of the millennium by a decade already. But it's all just numbers. We creep toward a reduced roster, reduced inventory of life, if and when we ever undertake one, without even knowing what we're losing. It's funny the way these two watersheds snug up tight against one another, so connected and integral, sewn or stitched together by the movements of the grizzly bears and mountain goats, the wolves and wolverine that travel back and forth from one to the other, and yet somehow having gotten to the same place in the story, injury, through different paths. The restoration in the Clark Fork involved digging up and tearing out a dam, while up in the Kootenai, we're talking about filling in and covering up a pit, putting an impermeable clay cap over a giant hole in the top of a mountain that has already been dug out, a place that never should have been dug up in the first place. The biology of our afflictions, the convergence of metaphor, where our lives and mistakes become our illnesses, and our scars our birthrights. The forced move in a designed space that seems to suggest increasingly the presence of destiny. What does it mean? What are we to make of it? Scott's carved out hip represents only the backside curve of the mountains we've been able to protect up along the Canadian border with Senator John Tester's brave wilderness bill. Part, but not yet all. It's enough for now. It's holding things together, a fragmented part scalloped for now out of what was previously a whole, still functioning, still intact if ailing, and yet we want and need more. And just a little farther south, also in the yak, we've healed Robin. Now we need to heal Vermiculite Mountain. I'm not sure how. And what of all those little poisons, daily poisons, millions of pounds of ore removed each day for 50 years, now a swirl in the world? The poison hasn't gone away. It's merely being redistributed. We need to remember this. We need to find a story that deals with this reality and helps guide us and others through it. I wonder if we have to gain back every small poison one at a time, as if picking up pebbles to be encased in a vast sheet of ice or some other temporarily safe place, or absorbed by the trees of trunks and plants to be held still and stable for a while, and encased within the seal of clay, as if held within the bodies and the land's scar tissue. Such encasements, by ice or clay or tree or the animal body, will occur one breath at a time, one small act at a time, one considered gesture at a time, one ceremony at a time. Such recovery will take generations. I imagine such concerted small steps flying from each of us like glittering dust in the wind, or like the millions of gold needles that fly from larch trees each fall, laying themselves down upon the fire-blackened September wet firescapes of the previous summer. The larch needles acting as a netting to hold together the sometimes damaged soil, and beginning once more the process of rebuilding that which has gone away. The dust upon our lungs cast a net of poison, but there can be healing nets too. In a time of converging metaphors, as might have been the case in the beginning, back when the world was new, stories matter. In our observation, imagination, and actions, we possess the double-edged power of responsibility, for the stories we embed into our culture will direct the flow and shape of the subsequent rivers of culture that follow the bounds and borders of those stories. Stories generally flow downhill. Much will follow them. How do we reverse a story of poison on the Kootenai? Clearly by restoring. Instead of imagining a trillion toxic fibers swirling through the air, being vacuumed into people's lungs with every breath, it might be helpful to imagine, to remember, 1,000 third and second order tributaries diving down into the main stem of the Clark Fork and bringing life, not death. I don't mean to counsel denial. There is poison in our past and poison in our lives. But I think it is important from a story perspective that in the next 25 to 50 years, inhabitants of compromised watersheds think of themselves not as toxic victims, but survivors, restorationists. We can't control the future, but as Bill Kittredge reminds us, we can determine the stories we inhabit. Stepping into the future and passing through it, I suppose, with the irretrievability of water flowing. And those stories certainly direct the course and nature of that river and the future. Every watershed in these 5 contiguous watershed nation states of my home, the Clark Fork, the Kootenai, the Salmon Snake, the St. Joe Coeur d'Alene, the Missouri Yellowstone, has poisons to extract and soil to heal, green gardens to grow to feed us, and wild forests, burning, rotting, growing young again, growing old again, on the mountain slopes above these rivers. Every watershed in those 5 nation states has a long list of threatened, endangered, and sensitive species, the recovery of which will also help restore various rust-bound or gridlocked ecological processes between species and landscape, with the movements of these animals between the 5 nations acting like sutures, stitches, sewing back together what's been injured. For some recoveries, we'll have to be as creative and imaginative and committed as we know how. I'm sure there are biologists who, frustrated from working long years at the Varques at Libby Dam, would swear that it is easier for a fat man to pass through the eye of a needle than to manage water flows and wildly different needs simultaneously for spawning Kootenai River sturgeon, an endangered species, and bull trout, a threatened species, while also addressing flood control and power generation and the needs of salmon. A fine mess we've gotten ourselves into with our incessant and bottomless hungers. Maybe another vision for the next 50 years is one where we're not quite so hungry, or rather hungrier for different things, things inside us rather than the ores and metals of the earth. A vision of more spirit and spirituality and a little less taking, maybe a lot less taking. I know that's asking a lot. Most of our stories are old stories that simply play themselves over with but slight reassembly of the primal elements. There are few new things under the sun. We pretty much need to keep building our new stories with our old words. I like it that the Clark Fork exists just a little north of a town called Wisdom and a little south of one called Paradise. I like that there is a town called Heron along its banks, and caught too in the net of our geography are words like Superior and Trout Creek, Sweat House, and Hellgate. In this story fits reality notion, this biology of restoration becoming a fitting match with the biology of the affliction, it occurs to me that grassroots watershed groups like the Clark Fork Coalition and the Yak Valley Forest Council are gathering momentum like a river, and that each person who labors on behalf of his or her home is like one of those swirling fibers or those tiny tributaries coming down from out of the mountains to join it and feed into it. Such activists may think that like a bear or an elk, you are coming down to water's edge for only a drink, but they're doing something more. Somehow, and I'm not quite sure how this works, they are repairing the rivers, stitching them back. And to someone who likes to stay up on the ridges and look down at the rivers, I am grateful for that. My own visions are tame little next step things. My visions are of things I can already see. When the Dalai Lama comes to Montana next year, I want to see him bless not just the Clark Fork, but the Kootenai, with its corporate crimes and civil rights abuses. Maybe he can convene other religious leaders. There is already an economic and environmental and increasingly scientific consciousness of the river and its watershed. It makes sense to me that the next phase should call for a more explicit acknowledgement of the river's importance to the spirits of things. In the end, call me unimaginative, but the only thing I have to request of the future then, really, is that those other inhabitants beyond ourselves are secure in the watershed. I'm more of a bear guy than a trout guy. I lean more toward rock than water. I really don't even like to get my feet wet. I wish I had more to ask for in and of the future. It makes me feel like a not very good environmentalist to not have a robust and complicated 50-year battle plan, particularly with so much technology available to us now. But I know there are great scientists and artists and activists and business people and leaders out there who do have such battle plans. I guess all I'd ask of those people is to please remember to make sure a bear can come down from out of the Yak and make it into the Bitterroots, then Yellowstone, then the Wind Rivers. The Wind Rivers. What a lovely name. In the old days, the name Clark Fork meant poison, meant destruction, meant greed and abuse, meant the failure to preserve that which was once special. Now the name Clark Fork has currency again, and I'm grateful to it for letting me live there for a while. And I apologize again for the tameness or even absence of my vision for the next 50 years. I'm the one who wears a life jacket in the inner tube. A vision? I do not have one yet. For the most part, I'm just trying to get by day. Like the Kootenai, the Clark Fork is a big watershed with lots of challenges, and I suspect we will need almost every one of those 50 years, if not more, to figure such things out. But from where I am, looking down through the trees, it seems like maybe we're on the right track. We might even get out of this alive. Thank you guys for having me down here. Oh, sure. Yeah, you bet. Yeah.
Where's swift-footed Ian? Yes.
Thank you.
Thanks, Ian. A question for you. So you mentioned the development of instincts at the beginning of this and how it takes perhaps thousands of years for people to develop the same instincts in this country. And I'd like to argue that I think our first instinct has been developed in this room is for people like you who have this development of environmentalism to want to protect the wilderness that's left in this country. And I want to hear more about how we can form that environmental resilience through these transitions that people have to protect this wilderness. And through that, I want to hear a little bit more about yours. So how did you become an environmentalist from being a petroleum geologist? Can you tell us a little bit more about that transition?
Yes. I've always admired people who can answer a question beginning with the first part and working their way to the end. I'm not one of those people, so let me start at the back. The only thing I can remember is the very last thing you said. I used to be an oil and gas geologist, and which was a fantastic profession. It was like a kid looking for buried treasure. I mean, you've got, it was very much like writing. You've got a few clues, and you're looking, the way in writing you have a few emotions, maybe a line of dialogue, a setting, an idea. In oil and gas exploration, you've just got a few well log, maybe an outcrop over here, a few old well logs, a lot of intuition, a lot of experience, a lot of loose things trying to create a whole. What was the question? How did I transition from oil and gas exploration to environmentalism? Well, even when I was down, this was in Mississippi where I lived. I was working on private lands, drilling these shallow little Paleozoic wells in North Alabama on farmers' soybean fields. But even then, I was kind of a budding environmentalist. I was editor for the Sierra Club newsletter, which totally flummoxed my oil and gas counterparts in the petroleum building, and they really looked suspect upon me. And then I got out. I'd studied. Let me back up. I'd studied wildlife science in Utah. To answer your question, how I made the transition. I fell in love with this landscape, the yak, and just committed myself to trying to protect the thing I love most about it, which is utterly wild quality. I'd never seen a place that wild. And that's a kind of instinct. When you love something and you see it threatened, you fight to protect it. So yeah, we do have instinct. I oversimplified to suggest that we don't. We don't have anywhere near as deep or quality, the same quality of instinct as the animals do, and we're aware of that, and that's, I think, the source of a lot of our confusion. But we do have instinct, and a lot of times we just don't trust it. We have good stories of instinct. We do. Hopefully, we'll get more in the coming millennia. I don't know if I answered the question. But, thanks.
In your book, you talk about how wilderness is a necessary part of our existence here. Talk more on that. Why wilderness and wild places are a necessary part of our civilized survival.
Boy, I've spent my life trying to answer that question, and I will spend the rest of it trying to answer it. It's a hard point to argue. If you get it, if you know it, it doesn't need answering. And if you don't get it, there's nothing in the world that can persuade you otherwise. My left-wing, pinko liberal vision of civilization is one that includes tolerance of a diversity of viewpoints. Likewise, that it's a definition to me of democracy, or of a healthy democracy. And so in that canvas, in that fabric, in that portfolio, if you want to use a business term, wilderness is just one of those components. If we don't have wilderness, then we're less different. We're more homogeneous. It's a very selfish response. I need the wilderness. I have no doubt that there are a lot of people in our culture, in our civilization, who don't need wilderness. And I would be pompous and pious to preach to them that, young man, young woman, what you need is wilderness. Maybe not everybody needs wilderness. All I can say is I need it. And I consider myself a very small part of our civilization, but a part. And so by reducing, it's going to take me 50 years to answer, another 50 years to answer that question. Sorry. Sure.
I just got done reading one of your books, The Lost Grizzlies, and I really enjoyed it. It was a lot of fun.
Sure.
And so it got me thinking about wildlife corridors, how we're starting to do something along those lines, with the bridges crossing interstates and tunnels and different things. And I was just wondering kind of how you felt about the different parts that are involved with wildlife corridors, that involves immigration with Canadians and Mexicans and a whole lot of stuff. So it's not a complicated question, but I was just wondering, if you had any specific thoughts on wildlife corridors and their benefit to our state.
Again, back to that intuitive belief that I have that diversity is healthy. I remember a freshman wildlife biology class I had, the scientist blew me away. He was saying, we don't have a scientific formula that proves that diversity is good. We know it intuitively, but we can't prove scientifically that an ecosystem with 17 major species is healthier or stronger than one that just has 3. You know, it's the only formulas we have measure numbers, biomass. There aren't really formulas for giving qualitative assessments to diversity. I mean, you have different ways of measuring diversity, alpha and beta and gamma diversities, but there is no formula that tells you, proves this is healthy. It's just one of those things that we know, we're reassured by it, we're more comfortable in the presence of diversity. Our imagination is more active in the presence of diversity. We just feel more human in the presence of diversity. We feel rich, not depauperate. What was the question? Oh, why is it good for Colorado to have corridors? Yeah, I mean, ipso facto. I mean, if you've got, you know, wild things moving back and forth across your landscape, more wild things instead of less, then I believe that's a healthier, stronger, better thing. And I don't have to wait around for a formula to tell me that it's so.
One more?
Yes, please.
In the past, there was a huge conflict between environmentalists and ranchers and farmers. Some of that's being transformed. In the past, there was a huge conflict between environmentalists and the ranching and farming community. In more recent years, there's been a more ambiguous and perhaps even a good, strong relationship. I know that, for example, on my farm, 2 endangered species have been residing on that farm. We provide habitat, old-growth willow, so we have the southwestern willow flycatcher, and the yellow-throated warbler. We're really proud of that in our community, of farming in nature's image, so that you're not just cultivating the hell out of everything, but you're living a lot of habitat for species to inhabit and to move through the corridors of the acequias, provide riparian corridors for all kinds of wildlife. Do you see this as part of the future of protecting and restoring the human relationship to the environment? That we're going to be able to reconcile inhabiting places as well as leaving some places alone?
Yes. No, it has been interesting, you know, as a career activist to see that change, that growth, that maturation of old conflicts, loggers and enviros up north, you know, ranchers and enviros down here, having earned, you know, a hard scar tissue, grudging respect of each other and develop trust, being honest even in the ferocity of battle, you know, it's led to some interesting relationships that I think will bear fruit for wildness, sustainability, resilience. Those who are left standing, you know, are resilient and have quite a bit of shared commonality despite perceived differences. So I think we may be getting to that point, and hopefully the land will accept that. There'll be some wild country left to accept those experiments. I am you know, trust the dealer but cut the cards, or whatever that saying is, as the default protective safeguard against our mistakes. We have to have wilderness, as much wilderness as we can protect anywhere and everywhere. That is not, it's not a black and white issue though. Wilderness does not need to prohibit logging elsewhere. Wilderness does not need to prohibit ranching elsewhere. We need that gold standard of wild, unmanaged, or relatively unmanaged country, you know, at the farther edges. But down in the place where human living goes on, those collaborations that you speak about are what are going to really matter in our stories and in our culture, whatever scary thing comes. And they were scary times. Again, Aaron, thank you for your gorgeous letter. It's haunting. I wish I hadn't heard it, but I'm a better person for it. And thank you again for that gorgeous music. I wish I had heard it, and I'm a better person for it. Thank you guys for having me here.
Just real quick, remember tomorrow at 9 o'clock, the passing of the gourd led by our good signs. Also, for those of you who are new to the Headwaters Conference, we're moving away from paper mailings. We're moving to an email list. I promise less than 5 emails a year. Brian, just also swift-footed, Brian has a email list for those of you who are interested in what's going to be going on next year. Enrique's Salmon on the way to the airport this morning suggested story as next year's theme. Play off of that. That would make for another sequel. But tomorrow at 9 o'clock, we're passing the gourd, and then after 9 o'clock, those of you who are interested, we're going to sit down and talk about next year. So we can go in many directions. Thank you all so much for coming, and have a great night.